The landlord of this house lost over $200,000 in non-payment of rent and property damages combined. My name's Daniel Hale. I'm a real estate agent and I work with a ton of landlords, which means I deal with a lot of landlord and tenant board issues. And I'm starting to share these stories to help create awareness in hopes that we can solve these problems. So make sure you subscribe and like this video because it helps spread the word a lot. Now, this landlord called me to sell his house because the tenant owed him $26,000 in rent and he told me there were a lot of property damages. So I showed up to this property to go take a look, and let me tell you, it was an absolute mess. And it was extremely sad to see because this house wasn't that old. It was about only 10 to 15 years old in Mississauga, Ontario. Gorgeous home. The market value of it renovated was about $1.3 million. Absolutely beautiful. A stunner of a house. And when I got there, let me tell you, I can't believe what I saw. It was a disaster. The carpets were absolutely destroyed throughout the entire house. The kitchen cabinets were all chipped, beat up, broken. The appliances were shot. There was leaks coming through all of the ceilings. There was holes in the walls. The kids drew all over the walls with marker, crayon. There was even a swing set that was drilled to the ceiling of the living room. I've never seen this before, and every single time I think I've seen it all, I see something else. So what we did, we got the paralegal to serve the N4 notice for non-payment of rent, and we got that paralegal to also file it to the landlord and tenant board. Now in Ontario, you're looking at about a 4 to 5 month waiting period for your hearing. And if the tenant doesn't leave after that order, you're still waiting for the sheriff to arrive. So during that time, you're also having to float the property if the tenant isn't paying rent. Now, another thing you need to know in Ontario, though, is that if the tenant does pay you the entirety of everything that they owe you, your N4 notice for non-payment of rent that you served the tenant gets thrown in the garbage and they get to stay, which means they could do it over again. And of course, there's measures to take care of that, but they could kick the ball down the street for quite some time, and the landlord wanted to sell the house as well because the property damages were just getting worse, and the worse they get, the lower he's going to end up having to sell that house for. So we filed to the landlord and tenant board. We made sure everything was done correctly through our paralegal on the team, and we put the house up for sale. We were getting a lot of showings. We were getting a lot of feedback based on the current state of the house. And when the landlord talked to me about this, about getting the eviction and then renovating the house, we actually realized that if he did that, he would be out a lot more money. And the reason for it is because when we sold this property, the market was on a decline with all the interest rates rising and rising and rising. It didn't make sense for him to go put the $150,000 to $200,000 into that house in renovations because he wouldn't get it back. So we ended up selling the property for $1.1 million. And what we did was we actually sold it in as-is condition, and we made sure we wrote that on the agreement of purchase and sale so that nothing could come back to him during the time of the eviction and he can get sued for any further damages. Yes, the buyer did get it under market value, but we actually believe we still sold it for a good price considering what the state of this property was. Now, if it was fully renovated, you're looking at 1.3 to 1.35 million, which is obviously a lot more, plus all the rental money that he lost. He accumulated around a $200,000 loss just off of this property. So what ended up happening was we kept showings going because we wanted to have people going through the property as much as possible because this bothers the tenant, wants to push the tenant out of the property and make them start realizing that they have to make some decisions for themselves, whether they're going to move or what they're going to do. Now, of course, this tenant wasn't paying rent, so he stuck it out and waited until the landlord and tenant board hearing, which a lot of them will do, but you don't want them in there not comfortable. And of course, we did want to sell the house, but if you have the showings going, it also puts them in a position where they don't want to stay because of all these showings. It's an inconvenience to their life, and that's what we wanted. You don't want a tenant in there not paying rent, kicking his feet up, and just trying to procrastinate and stay longer and longer and longer, and then we got to wait for that board eviction. We'd rather know that we can have the non-payment of rent eviction plus the sale eviction. We have two options to make sure that this happens and that it gets done. And thankfully, we got a buyer that wanted to buy the property, which we always do. You just keep the showings going. Somebody will fall in love with the house. We'll work out an agreement, and we sold them the property in as-is condition. And we also had our landlord and tenant board hearing, which was coming up in a couple of months. So I knew how I could navigate this for a closing date for them. I made sure that I put a clause in the agreement of purchase and sale to allow us to extend the closing date to make sure that we could get the eviction with the board and actually have this buyer get the vacant possession that they wanted. And we even let them do a home inspection just so that they could see for their own comfort everything that was going on in the house before they went firm on the property. So we had our hearing date within a couple of months, and what the tenant actually did was the tenant moved out of the property right after the hearing date. They knew the way that the landlord and tenant board goes in Ontario, and if you know the way the landlord and tenant board is in Ontario, you know that even if you get a hearing date and you get that eviction order, the tenant still does have a certain period of time before the sheriff actually arrives, because you do the landlord and tenant board hearing, and then you have about 3 to 4 weeks before you actually get an order notice from the board, which then has a date on it, which is typically another 15 to 20 days, somewhere around there, where you can then apply to the sheriff and wait for that sheriff. So what he did was he got the order from the landlord and tenant board, he knew when he was being evicted, and then he moved out of the property. So the landlord ended up having to float all of the expenses on the property up until the tenant left. The tenant left, we cleaned out the entire property, we made sure it was prepared for the buyer, we sold it for $1.1 million, but he lost just over $200,000 between rent and property damages combined. One of the biggest losses I have seen out of everybody I've assisted from this channel, but thankfully within that 5 to 6 month period, we were able to solve all the problems, get it sold, get the tenant out, and get it closed, get the landlord his funds, and stop the bleeding. Now, I wish I could say this is the only time I ever dealt with a scenario like this, but sadly, it happens all the time, which is why I'm sharing these stories now, so I can help create awareness, and hopefully we see some change with the Ontario Landlord and Tenant Board.